And that uncertainty is perhaps the most honest summary of what the Blitzkrieg left in its wake. A continent full of people about whom history recorded only the beginning of the story. France fell in 6 weeks, Poland in 5, the Netherlands in 5 days, Denmark in 6 hours. These are not statistics. These are the measurements of a world being remade with industrial violence and revolutionary speed. And when the dust settled, when the armistice was signed, when the occupation governments were installed, when the victory parades had marched through captured capitals, the question that remained was not whether the Blitzkrieg had succeeded. It was whether success of that kind could ever be sustained. The answer, in the end, was no. The same doctrine that had swept Europe broke against the vastness of the Soviet Union like a wave against a cliff. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, began with stunning German victories. Army Group Center advanced 500 kilometers in its first weeks, but the Soviet Union was simply too large, too populous, and ultimately too determined. The supply lines that Guderian's speed had always outrun finally gave way. The Blitzkrieg stalled in the mud and snow outside Moscow in December 1941, and the Germans never recovered their momentum. What nobody tells you is that the Blitzkrieg was never as invincible as it appeared. Every major campaign contained moments where Allied coordination, better communications, or slightly different decisions could have stopped the German advance. The French had the tanks. They had, arguably, better individual tank designs in the Char B1 and the Matilda. What they lacked was doctrine. They scattered their armor in small parcels across the front, supporting infantry, while Germany concentrated its armor in massive fists and swung for the jaw. The technology was similar. The thinking was not. The legacy of the Blitzkrieg did not die with the Third Reich. Every modern military on Earth studied it. The American air-land battle doctrine of the 1980s, the doctrine used to liberate Kuwait in 1991 in 100 hours, was built on the same principles Guderian had preached in 1935. Speed, shock, penetration, getting inside the enemy's decision cycle before they can respond. The Israeli Defense Forces rebuilt their entire strategic concept around mobility and preemption after 1948. The Blitzkrieg, stripped of its Nazi context, became the template for every high-speed conventional war fought in the second half of the 20th century. In the broader sweep of history, the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941 represent something more disturbing than military brilliance. They represent the danger of a gap between doctrine and reality. Of militaries that prepare for the previous war, of politicians who mistake aggression for strength until it is far too late, of democracies that confuse peace-seeking with peacemaking. The appeasement at Munich did not prevent war. It merely chose the time and ground on which that war would be most difficult to survive. The world that the Blitzkrieg made, the world of occupied Europe, of shattered democracies, of populations delivered into the hands of the most murderous regime in modern history. That world took 6 years, 60 million dead, and the complete industrial mobilization of 3 continents to unmake. And even then, the unmaking was partial. The borders drawn afterward, the Cold War divisions that followed, the European project that arose from the ruins, all of it was built in the shadow of what those 6 weeks in the spring of 1940 had demonstrated. That civilization is not permanent, that the structures we trust to protect us can fail with breathtaking speed, that the gap between order and chaos, between a world that functions and one that burns, is far narrower than anyone in the comfortable years before the storm had ever allowed themselves to believe. The tanks that rolled through the Ardennes in May 1940 have long since rusted into the earth. The men who drove them are gone. The generals who planned the campaigns, the leaders who ordered them, the soldiers who executed them with terrifying brilliance and terrifying obedience, they have all passed into history. But the lesson has not. Speed without wisdom is just destruction. Power without restraint is just catastrophe in motion. And the world that refuses to learn the difference will, eventually, find itself standing on the wrong side of a line that cannot be uncrossed. It always does. The man who had spent his entire career arguing that tanks should not support infantry, infantry should support tanks. Guderian believed in speed as a weapon in itself, not just moving faster than the enemy, moving faster than the enemy's ability to think, to communicate, to respond. His Panzer Corps crossed the Meuse River at Sedan on May 13, 1940, after Stuka dive bombers screamed down in waves that silenced the French artillery. The crossing took 18 hours of brutal fighting. What happened next took everyone's breath away. Guderian did not wait to consolidate. He did not pause to secure his flanks, as classical military doctrine demanded. He drove west, faster than his own high command wanted. At one point, he received an order from his superior, General Ewald von Kleist, to halt. Guderian threatened to resign. He was given a face-saving compromise, a reconnaissance in force that allowed him to keep moving. He drove his tanks 300 kilometers in 11 days. His spearheads reached the English Channel at Abbeville on May 20th. The Allied armies in Belgium were completely encircled. Imagine you are a French general in that moment. Your phone lines are cut. Your runners are not returning. The reports that are reaching you describe German armor appearing from directions that your maps tell you are impossible. The very geography you trusted to protect your flank is the geography that has killed you. The world you understand, the world of fixed fronts, of methodical artillery preparation, of armies that advance and pause and advance again. That world no longer exists. You are trying to fight a fire with a library book about fire. What nobody tells you is that the Germans were terrified too. Guderian's flanks were exposed for days. His supply lines were stretched almost to breaking. If the French had managed to coordinate even a modest counterattack at the right moment, the armored thrust could have been cut off and destroyed. On May 21st, British tanks at Arras did exactly that. They hit the flank of Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and briefly sent the German advance into crisis. Rommel himself reported being attacked by hundreds of tanks when the actual number was 74. Panic works both directions. But the French could not coordinate. Their command structure was built for a different pace of war. Their communications were too slow, their doctrine too rigid, their generals too old in their thinking. General Maxime Weygand, who took command of French forces on May 19th, needed 2 full days just to organize a meeting with Allied commanders. In 2 days, Guderian could cross a country. The British Expeditionary Force, roughly 338,000 men, was driven back to the beaches of Dunkirk. What followed was the miraculous evacuation that Churchill called a colossal military disaster before the press tried to make it a triumph. The men were saved. The equipment was not. Thousands of tanks, guns, and vehicles were left on the beaches of France. Britain had escaped with its army and lost almost everything else. France fought on for 3 more weeks, but the fight was psychological now, not military. Paris fell on June 14, 1940. The French government signed the armistice on June 22nd in the same railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, where Germany had signed its humiliating surrender in 1918. Hitler personally attended. He was photographed doing a small jig outside the carriage. In 6 weeks, the nation that had held the Western Front for 4 years in the previous war had ceased to exist as an independent military power. And yet there was a moment, buried in those 6 weeks, that should have changed everything. On May 24, 1940, with British forces trapped at Dunkirk, with the armored units poised to finish the job, Hitler issued his famous halt order. The panzer divisions were to stop their advance. The reasons remain debated to this day. Some historians point to Hermann Göring's insistence that the Luftwaffe alone could finish the British, others to concerns about the tank's mechanical condition, others to Hitler's bizarre belief that a negotiated peace with Britain was still possible. Whatever the reason, the tanks stopped for 2 critical days, and 338,000 soldiers escaped into the sea. The Blitzkrieg had consumed Western Europe in less than 3 months, but the man who designed it, the machine that executed it, was already turning east, toward a vastness that no doctrine of speed had ever been tested against. The war that everyone thought was almost over was, in the most terrible sense, only just beginning. There is a letter in the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London. It was written by a young French conscript named Maurice Leblanc, not the novelist, a different man entirely, to his mother in Lyon, postmarked May 15, 1940, 5 days into the German attack. He writes, "Maman, we do not understand what is happening. The Germans appear where there are no roads. Our officers tell us to hold a position and then are gone before we can ask where they went. I have not slept in 3 days. I am not afraid. I think I am too tired to be afraid." Maurice Leblanc was captured on May 28th. He spent the next 5 years in a German prisoner of war camp in Silesia. He survived. Most of the men in his unit did not. His letter, small and faded and written in a cramped hand that grows more erratic toward the bottom of the page, captures something no military history can fully quantify: the experience of being inside the Blitzkrieg from the wrong side. Not defeat as strategy, defeat as bewilderment. The civilian populations endured something different. Imagine you are a resident of Rotterdam on May 14, 1940. The Netherlands has been at war for 4 days. There are negotiations happening. A surrender is being discussed. And then, at 1:27 in the afternoon, 90 German Heinkel E-111 bombers arrive over your city. The bombs fall for 15 minutes. When they stop, the medieval heart of Rotterdam is burning. Estimates of the dead range from 800 to 1,000 people. 85,000 are homeless. The Dutch government surrenders that evening. The bombing of Rotterdam was not an accident and not entirely planned. German communications attempting to call off the raid failed. Some squadrons had already dropped their bombs before the recall signal reached them. But here is what the history books leave out. The terror it produced was not an unintended side effect of Blitzkrieg. It was a core component. The doctrine understood from its inception that psychological collapse preceded military collapse. You did not need to kill every soldier. You needed to make every civilian, every official, every general believe that resistance was not just futile, but insane. On the roads of Belgium and northern France, millions of civilians fled. The refugee columns, stretching for miles, clogged the very roads the Allied armies needed to move troops and supplies. German aircraft attacked some of those columns deliberately. The chaos and terror they created was itself a weapon. A French officer named André Beaufray later wrote in his memoirs, "We were not simply outfought, we were unmade. The disorder that surrounded us was not the disorder of battle. It was something more total, a dissolution of everything we believed to be solid." On the German side, soldiers kept diaries too. A Wehrmacht infantryman named Hans-Georg Reimann wrote to his wife in Hamburg in June 1940, "It does not feel like a great victory. The French look at us with such hatred and such emptiness at the same time. The children do not run. I expected them to run. They just stand and watch." Hans-Georg Reimann was transferred to the Eastern Front in 1941. He was killed near Smolensk in October of that year. He was 24 years old. For the Jewish populations of occupied territories, what began in 1939 and 1940 was not conquest. It was the beginning of annihilation. In Poland alone, German forces began implementing anti-Jewish laws within weeks of the invasion, forcing hundreds of thousands into ghettos, stripping them of property, of citizenship, of protection. The Blitzkrieg was not only a military tactic, it was also the mechanism by which the Third Reich extended the geography of its persecution with extraordinary speed. By the time the world fully understood the scale of what was happening, the borders of occupied Europe had already enclosed millions of people who had nowhere left to go. Somewhere in those photographs, in the archives of Yad Vashem, in the collection of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, there is a picture of a woman standing in a Warsaw street in 1940. She is well dressed. She is carrying a small suitcase. She is looking at the camera with an expression that is utterly unreadable. Her name has not been conclusively identified. We do not know what happened to her. We may never know. They had more tanks, more artillery, more men under arms. France alone could field an army that had humbled the greatest military power on earth just 20 years before. Britain stood behind it, the Royal Navy ruling every ocean. Poland had fought off Soviet invasion with cavalry and sheer ferocity. On paper, by every measurable calculation of military strength, Nazi Germany should have been crushed within months of firing its first shot. And yet, in less time than it takes a university student to complete a single academic year, Adolf Hitler's forces had swallowed an entire continent. The question that has haunted historians, strategists, and survivors for 8 decades is not simply how Germany won. The question is why everyone else, despite every advantage, simply fell apart. To understand what happened, you must first understand the world as it existed in the years before the storm broke. It was a world still bleeding from the First World War. The Great War, as people called it then, had consumed 17 million lives between 1914 and 1918. It had shattered 4 empires. It had redrawn every map from the English Channel to the Persian Gulf. And when it finally ended, the men who survived it carried something home with them beyond their medals and their wounds. They carried a bone-deep certainty that nothing on earth could ever justify doing that again. That certainty shaped everything. It shaped the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 with terms so punishing toward Germany that the French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, a man who had watched rivers of blood flow across his country, looked at the document and reportedly said, "This is not peace. This is an armistice for 20 years." He was off by less than 12 months. The treaty stripped Germany of territory, dismantled its military, and imposed reparation payments so crushing that the German economy would spend the next decade in a state of managed collapse. Inflation came first. Then the Great Depression arrived like a second plague in 1929, and what little stability remained dissolved entirely. Into that void stepped Adolf Hitler. He did not seize power in a midnight coup. He was appointed Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933, through a democratic process by men who believed they could control him. They could not. Within months, he had dismantled every democratic institution in Germany. Within 2 years, he had violated the Versailles Treaty openly, rebuilding the German military with a speed and ambition that shocked European intelligence agencies. And yet the response from France, Britain, and the League of Nations was not resistance. It was appeasement, a word that would become a synonym for catastrophe. The great powers of Europe were not cowardly. They were exhausted. Britain's political establishment had a generation of young men who had never come home from Flanders. France had lost 1.4 million soldiers in the previous war and had no appetite to spend that currency again. So, they watched. They negotiated. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and returned waving a piece of paper announcing, "Peace for our time." Hitler had promised him Czechoslovakia would be his last territorial demand. That promise lasted exactly 6 months. By the summer of 1939, German engineers, tacticians, and commanders had been quietly building something the world had never seen. Not just an army, a philosophy of warfare, a doctrine built on speed, shock, and psychological terror. They called it Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. The rest of the world would come to know it by a different name. And when it was finally unleashed, the generals who faced it would realize, too late, that they had been preparing to fight the last war while Germany had invented the next one. A decision was about to be made. In Berlin, behind closed doors, in the early hours of a summer morning, one man was preparing to give an order that would detonate the European peace like a buried mine. Nobody standing in the streets of Warsaw, Paris, or London that morning had any idea what was coming. And the man giving that order? He was convinced it would all be over before Christmas. The date was September 1st, 1939. At 4:45 in the morning, the German warship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on a Polish military garrison at Westerplatte on the edge of the Danzig harbor. The shells were still falling when 53 German divisions, approximately 1.5 million soldiers, crossed the Polish border from 3 directions simultaneously. It was not a declaration of war. It was a detonation. Hitler had made the decision weeks earlier. The historians Alan Bullock and Ian Kershaw both document the same portrait of a leader who had by this point convinced himself of his own infallibility. He had marched into the Rhineland and nobody stopped him. He had absorbed Austria and nobody stopped him. He had taken Czechoslovakia and nobody stopped him. Each capitulation by the Western democracies reinforced his belief that will alone could overcome material reality. Poland, he told his generals on August 22, 1939, would be his, and the Western powers would do nothing. He was half right. Britain and France did declare war on September 3rd, 2 days after the invasion began. But here is what the history books leave out. They declared war and then did almost nothing. France had mobilized its forces along the Maginot Line. that vast, celebrated fortress of concrete and steel that ran along the Franco-German border. It was, by any military assessment, impregnable. It was also almost entirely irrelevant to what Germany was planning. While France stared at its fortifications, Germany was staring at a forest. Poland, meanwhile, was being consumed. The Polish military fought with extraordinary courage. Let no one take that from them. Polish cavalry charges against German tanks have been mythologized as suicidal stupidity, but historians now largely agree that those charges were directed at infantry, not armor. The Poles were not fools. They were simply fighting an entirely new kind of war, with an entirely old kind of doctrine. And on September 17th, the Soviet Union stabbed them in the back from the east, honoring the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that Germany and the USSR had signed just weeks before. Poland fell in 35 days. The speed was staggering, the method was new, and somewhere in the briefing rooms of Paris and London, military planners were looking at their maps and asking a question they could not yet answer. How had it happened so fast? The answer was already moving. It was heading for the Ardennes forest, and when it emerged from those trees, nothing in Europe would ever be the same again. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was called the Phony War. 8 months of almost no fighting on the Western Front. Both sides sat in their positions. Troops played football in frozen fields. Journalists grew bored. Politicians gave speeches. And inside German high command, a quiet revolution in strategic thinking was taking place that would change the nature of warfare forever. The original German plan for invading France was called Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. In its first iteration, it was conventional, unimaginative, and almost identical to the Schlieffen Plan from the First World War, a massive sweep through Belgium. Allied commanders had anticipated exactly this. They had positioned their best forces, including the British Expeditionary Force, to meet it. What nobody anticipated was what happened next. A German general named Erich von Manstein had a different idea, an audacious, borderline insane idea. Manstein proposed sending the main armored strike not through Belgium at all, but through the Ardennes. The Ardennes was dense forest, steep ravines, narrow roads barely wide enough for a farm cart, let alone armored columns. The French High Command had assessed the Ardennes as impassable for tanks, and had stationed there only second-rate reserve divisions with minimal anti-tank capability. They considered it a shield. Manstein saw it as a scalpel. When Hitler heard the plan, he loved it immediately. Some historians suggest he had been thinking along similar lines independently. What matters is what happened on May 10, 1940. Germany launched simultaneous attacks in 3 directions. Army Group B crashed into Belgium and the Netherlands, exactly as Allied commanders expected. British and French forces surged north to meet it. It was a feint, brilliant, deliberate, and devastating. At the same moment, Army Group A, containing the bulk of Germany's armored strength, over 1,200 tanks, began squeezing through the Ardennes, 7 armored divisions moving through forest in a column that, if straightened, would have stretched from Paris to the German border. Leading that armored thrust was General Heinz Guderian.